Welcome to this episode of Consider It Blacklit. I am Kim, your host, and for those of you tuning in for the first time, Consider It Blacklit highlights films, television programs, and stage plays that feature African Americans both up front and behind the scenes. We also discuss social issues as it relates to some of these programs and how they may or may not impact our communities. So thank you for tuning in, and we hope you continue to tune in each week. Today, it is my pleasure to highlight the 2019-2020 season of the Harlem Stage. And joining me, I have Monique Martin, who is the Director of Programming for the Harlem Stage, as well as Daniel Carlton, who is an actor, playwright, and storyteller. Welcome, guys.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
Yes, I'm so excited to have you here. So why don't you tell our audience a little bit about yourselves? We'll start with you, Monique. You've been here before, so we're going to let you start.
I have been here before. It's my pleasure to come back and to be here with you. You had a guest host who was lovely the last time. I'm a programmer and a curator and a producer, and I've been with Harlem Stage for a little over 2 years as the newly appointed Director of Programming. And in that role, I'm responsible for bringing artists like Daniel and ideas as well. Sometimes we start the programming with an idea, and then we match that idea with an artist. And Daniel's project is an example of that.
Okay, that's great. Daniel, tell the audience about you.
I'm Daniel, a Harlem resident, and I'm an actor, playwright, storyteller, all the things you described. But the muse of a lot of my work is rooted in community and in Harlem and in our history and in our going forward. So that's probably the thing that moves me in terms of creating anything.
Oh, that's great. Now, I'm going to ask Monique to tell us a little bit about Harlem Stage. When we were setting up, someone was like, what is Harlem Stage and where is it? So I want you to tell the audience just a little bit about Harlem Stage and the historical significance of the venue.
Harlem Stage is a performing arts center in Harlem on Convent and 135th Street. It's part of the, not officially, but it is part of the City College campus. And it actually started over 30 years ago at Aaron Davis Hall as Aaron Davis Hall. And at that time, it was integrated into the City College campus as a performing arts center as part of the campus. And like many performing arts centers that are on a university campus, there's always kind of a tug of war between the dance department and the theater department and rentals. So there was a time in the late 90s where the executive director, Patricia Cruz, and the managing director, James King, looked across the street and saw this abandoned building that was surrounded by fencing and had been in disrepair and abandoned for a couple of decades. And they decided to try to understand what is that structure and how can we be a part of it. So fast forward to 2005, when the leadership, Pat and James, raised the money to renovate the building, upwards of $27 million.
Wow.
And that is, I would say, Pat's legacy is to see a building that then Harlem Stage, which was formerly Aaron Davis Hall, could have a theater of their own. It's a beautiful structure. I'd say it's one of the most beautiful venues in Harlem, and I dare say the city, and not just because I work there. It was built in the late 1800s as a water pumping station to bring fresh water to New York City when people were dying of waterborne diseases. So it has a beautiful structure at a time when workers had so much pride in their work, and it was utilitarian in that it was there not for public access, but just as a structure where water would run from the Croton Aqueduct to Harlem Stage, to the reservoir in Central Park, and then final destination, Battery Park.
Oh, wow.
So the water still runs under there. It is still sourcing water to New York City. So we like to say that where fresh water flows, now fresh ideas and fresh art and culture flows.
Oh,
so
wow.
that's the history of how Harlem Stage became the Gatehouse and became Harlem Stage. And now we are looking to just expand and meet the artists where they are and understand what do artists need now that perhaps they didn't when the theater opened in 2006. So it's an exciting time.
Wow, that's amazing. So let's talk about your new season. You have 2 themes. Why don't you tell the audience about the themes?
One theme is the Harlem Renaissance, and that is celebrating the centennial of the Harlem Renaissance. And the lens that I'm looking through, which really connects to Daniel's project and why I'm so excited about bringing his project and his voice to the theater, is I see people of color, specifically Black people, if we can look at the migration, the Great Migration from the South into Harlem during that time of the turn of the century, really, right after Jim Crow. And the community was under a lot of oppressed conditions similar to what we're experiencing now. There's an uptick in hate crimes, there's an uptick in abuse of power, and there is an uptick in creativity and Black excellence.
That's true.
So what was happening then is happening now. So the lens that I'm looking through is looking at the Harlem Renaissance as referential and looking at how can we respond to what's going on now and use that same kind of vibrancy. So that's one, is the Harlem Renaissance Centennial, and 2, Afrofuturism, and looking at Sun Ra and his legacy of really the radical Black imagination. To think about yourself in the future is a radical thing, especially as a Black person, when the world is telling you that you are not valuable.
Exactly.
Or
And
not
a lot of
as
images we
valuable.
see about the future, we're not in them.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And Sun Ra had a vision of that, in like 1919.
Right.
Right? From Arkansas. I use either from Arkansas or Mississippi, I don't want to misquote. But he's from the South, let's just say that. He's from the South. So here's this Black man in the South that sees himself in the future, that sees himself as coming from Saturn, that sees himself as someone who was composing music with Fletcher Henderson. So he comes out of a jazz tradition, but he's marrying those traditions with futurism. So now we see artists like Solange, artists like Janelle Monáe, we see Afropunk, we see this, explosion of just a range of Black expression, both in fashion, in music, in theater, and we want to amplify that
Right.
in any way
And
we
I think
can.
it's amazing that you'll be introducing a new audience to Sun Ra, because I talk to a lot of young people, they have no clue as
Yeah.
who he is.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So Daniel, why don't you tell us about how you're participating in this new season?
Yes. I was just thinking about something she said also, is like how W.E.B. Du Bois was writing speculative fiction back during the first Harlem Renaissance, that he was imagining us in the future beyond double consciousness. It's like almost like quadruple consciousness.
Right.
Like, how do we travel through time? So my contribution is rent parties and the idea of celebration in spite of and because of, and as a reaction to, but not a reactionary reaction to it, if that makes sense. So my contribution is I'm going to recreate the idea of rent parties through the lens of invitations that Langston Hughes used to receive and collect for rent parties.
Wow, I haven't heard the term rent parties for a long
Right.
time.
Yes.
For the young people watching,
Yes.
explain to them what a rent party is.
Well, this is very interesting because even on the invitations, very few of them describe them as rent parties.
Oh, really?
But the bottom line is they need to raise some rent money, just like now. I was thinking about how the origin of a rent party, even in the context of Harlem, when you think about today, yesterday, is that many people were complaining about the high rents that, they would come from the South and Caribbean, all these places, and they come. and they were in these crowded conditions and being charged double what somebody downtown would be paying for twice the amount of space.
Wow.
Right? So a rent party existed on two levels. One was to raise that money to get their rent. You know, sometimes people, you know, by Friday night, you know, that rent money was already like in trouble, you know what I mean? And you still got to get through 3 more weeks, you know? And so people would throw parties to raise money to pay the rent, but also so that they could keep traditions going that they came from. You know, so a rent party might be, and at the height of rent parties, the first range of them, you might have 20 rent parties going on in the same connected buildings, right?
So people just party hopping.
People were party hopping. People were, you had a quarter, you get in, you have another quarter, all you can eat chitlins, or all you can drink,
Gumbo,
you know, gumbo.
all the foods that you
horrible.
know.
Although Langston
Not all of
Hughes,
it.
I love how Langston Hughes described it though. He said he didn't go to rent parties to eat, because he said the food wasn't necessarily, you know, for a quarter. He said, but you could drink, you know, and by the time you drank enough, the food was delicious.
Wow, that is funny.
So that's what a rent party was.
Right,
It was sort of, it was a way that people economically, but also I learned something in my research about rent parties, which makes total sense, is that during the first wave of the Harlem Renaissance, during the 20s, that a lot of, when Harlem was in vogue, people were coming uptown, and a lot of people who would hang out, Harlem residents, would go to bars and cabarets, but they started to be flooded with people who started to come up to Harlem to kind of gaze at people, almost like they were, you know, behind some cage or in a zoo or something. And so people also had rent parties as a way that they could party and be with community without the white gaze.
Oh,
right?
Wow.
So you're saying that the distinction between the Cotton Club, where those kinds of venues where folks would come from downtown to come uptown and watch the spectacle.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
And the other value that the rent parties gave is, sure, they were there as an economic driver for rent. That's a real. But also if someone needed money to cover funeral costs, if someone needed money to bury, you know, or if you needed to send somebody down south real quick for whatever reason, or bring somebody from the south up north real quick for whatever reason. So they were, you know, when we think about philanthropy, especially in the arts, there's a big debate about what money goes to which institutions and what is valuable. Is opera more valuable than Daniel's project? You know, and that's all about who controls that narrative of what is valuable. So part of what also happened in the salons is artists were able to, you know, create poetry, write poetry, recite poetry, test out their plays. So it really was an incubation space as well.
Oh, so much so that a lot of the musical trends that happened that became these huge musical movements would start with a piano player at some of these places, like the Stride pianos and Johnson, and even Ellington would come and test out material at parties. Because in the first wave of parties, usually you had a piano. That was like the main instrument, and then people would bring all kind of stuff in.
Have a little jam session.
And have jam sessions, and then, but also away from the white gaze.
Right.
You know, because people come up to Harlem and just outright stealing. Right.
So how are you incorporating these rent parties into the programming of the season, like the event?
So the event is based on, once again, this idea of Langston Hughes, who is how I was introduced to these rent parties. So I imagine, like, in 3 different eras that people are coming, and they're coming to the parties looking for Langston Hughes, who never shows up. You know? But they're looking for him.
Okay.
And as they're looking for him, you know, you find out their reason for being. And then we'll get, you know, some of the dances in, and we'll get some of the language in, and we'll get some of this, the imagery in there, so that you really sort of get an idea. You might not see the actual party, but there's another factor to this that I'm really excited about.
Okay.
And that is the bid whist also aspect of it. So,
yes. The trash talking and everything?
All of it. So, you know, a lot of these parties, they were set up as, you know, they didn't say rent party, they would say like a social whist party. Or in some of these invitations, there was something about either bid whist or tea or stuff like that, because, you know, people also wanted to sort of compete and like this idea that would drag people in, and also for these tea parties, which in the 20s were kind of also code language for like there's going to be some liquor.
Oh,
you know?
oh, okay.
So so there's all that. So I really want to show that world of like
it was a little subversive.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
I think we've always had coded language.
Yes.
And with the new opening of Harriet, you're seeing that.
Yeah.
And we've always had that kind of double consciousness and coded language. And in these rent parties, you would have that as well. And people would have to compete because there were so many,
There were
which I
so
didn't
many.
know there were as many as you just talked about.
Oh,
so
yeah.
what makes your rent party special? Why
could
would I
be-
come to
yes.
yours and
Right,
not come to his?
right.
That's right.
Is it either the gumbo or I'm going to start here?
Yes.
And then work their way.
Or
Oh,
it depends on
wow.
what you want. Like, for example, here's one I'm reading now from like 1942. And this is what attracted Langston Hughes, with the poetry at the top. Or like, so one says like, praise the Lord and pass the chitlins. Or one says, we got yellow girls, we got black and tan. Will you have a good time? Yeah, man. Social whisk party. So
Yeah.
I found one to be really interested about this idea of hanging out and not necessarily being about the money. So 409 Edgecombe, I found one from 409 Edgecombe, which was the height of sort of black excellence and the leaders, Du Bois and that whole crowd lived in that building. And I found some invitations for parties in that building, And one of the parties that I found was that they had these readers who would who would reach a fortune. And in those parties, they would have more than just music. They would have other types of situations going on, like fortune tellers, and they may have like a very sort of dedicated entertainment. So you might bring in Fats Waller, you might bring in some of the higher paid folks who would come in. So it's like the rent party wasn't just for rent. It was once again it was
other
also
things.
that
Yeah,
social
yeah.
gathering.
And that kind of ties into your programming season, because you don't just have performances, you're having discussions, a little technology. Tell us about some of the other people participating in it and some of the other things that are going to be done. Maybe some of the discussions you're going to have.
We have another take on the Harlem Renaissance, and that is live radio plays. We know that during the Renaissance, that was a form of entertainment, is families would sit around and listen to the radio. So what would that look like now? And one of my guilty pleasures is A Prairie Home Companion. I love that show.
Yes, I like it too.
And so I've always wanted to do, a cultured version of that. And so one of the artists in Sangu Njikum, he's creating a live radio play. And that will use some of the current elements, like a beatboxer, for the Foley. And with the radio plays, you have the sound effects, someone was knocking on the door. All of that makes it really exciting. So again, referential to the time, but using current technology to storytell is one of the ways that we're doing that. We also have Breonna Thomas coming, who's an extraordinary jazz vocalist with her band. She's doing a holiday show closing out the season on December 19th.
Oh, wow.
And next season we will be announcing soon. So stay tuned.
Okay. Well, one thing I did read that you had Nona Hendricks, who is the artistic director.
Right, of our Afrofuturism celebration. And Nona is in that lineage that I talked about from Sun Ra. So LaBelle, Earth, Wind and Fire, all of those groups who, again, those album covers, I just remember my dad and my family, they had pyramids and they were already looking to the future. So although it wasn't termed Afrofuturism or even futurism, I think that's one of the challenges that we have is we're always doing and being and surviving that we're not codifying our culture. And a lot of the quote unquote experts of our culture are not part of the culture. And thank God for them, but some things are not accurate. So, we have to be there. Or they forget
the soul,
Right. So we have to be there at the table, and this is where I'm looking at the Renaissance now. We are at the table. I mean, look at even Lena Waithe's new project, Slim, Queen and Slim.
Queen and Slim,
Yeah.
yes.
You know,
Yeah.
who would have thought that we would have our Black Bonnie and Clyde that has a level of elegance as well, you know, has a level of sophistication and not just this trope of this ghetto
Gangster.
that came from nobody, no parents, you know. So Nona Hendrix is part of that lineage, and we all know the legacy that she brings to the culture from her work with LaBelle. Many people don't know that she wrote a lot of that music,
Wow.
in LaBelle's hits, and
And she had a nice solo career too.
Absolutely. And she is one of the artists of that time that's connected to the younger generation. So what we're doing as one of the programs with Nona Hendrix in her leadership is she's connected to two artists from Philadelphia that are coming. Black Quantum Futurism is the name of this artist, and the other is More Mother. And they are using technology. They see themselves as, like, you know, the great granddaughters of Sun Ra, and they're inspired by his work, and they have their own interpretation of it. So it's exciting to see how Nona is a bridge, and she's allowing her knowledge, her experience to also inspire these younger artists. And that's what we want in our culture, for it to continue to be relevant and evolving.
Right, right. So I got excited because next summer I read that you were going to be focusing on George Clinton. And I grew up on him.
Yes.
I mean,
George Clinton, for many people know that he's retired.
Yeah.
And he keeps saying, all I want to do is go fishing with my grandchildren. And so we're one of many people that are like, what? Can you please do one more?
just one more song.
And, you know, prior to coming to Harlem Stage, I was with Summer Stage for many years, and we've presented him twice. You know, and it really is, he brings such a multi-generational audience. So you have people in their 50s, you have people in their 60s, you have people in their 20s, and everyone's having a great time. And that's what that music does, is that it really gets everybody pumped up. So what I'm saying is, George, you don't even have to perform. Like, we can just have you sit on a throne somewhere
And play your music. And we'll all dance and sing to it.
Right, we want to honor you.
We would probably out-sing him anyway. He probably wouldn't be able to hear himself.
Totally, because he just struts across the stage, and I'm not mad at him. At his age, he should be able to
He just
do
can't
that.
wear the diaper this time, that's all.
Right. Well, he stopped doing that a long time ago. He's in button-down suits. He's fly.
Okay,
He's very fly.
That's great. So tell our audience, how can they find out all about your new season? Where can they get tickets? Where can they find out about the programming? You know,
We're on all social media
Okay.
platforms at Harlem Stage, and we also, our website, we will be announcing our spring season in about 2 weeks,
Okay.
and that's harlemstage.org.
Okay.
Yeah.
So before we leave, I want Daniel to do a little performance.
Okay.
We'll do that later.
Okay.
Ooh.
But Daniel, I want you to tell our audience where they can find you on social media,
Okay.
on the internet.
So you can find me at www.danielcarlton.com. You can find me at Instagram, I'm Daniel Carlton, Twitter, I'm Daniel Carlton, Daniel Carlton on Facebook. I think I'm the first one that pops up, but I'm not sure. And then Daniel Carlton Storyteller, also on Facebook. And if you Google me, there are a lot of Daniel Carlton. So if you Daniel Carlton Harlem, or Daniel Carlton Actor, or Daniel Carlton Storyteller or something, some more specific things might show up too.
Okay, that's great. That's great. Well, we're going to put on the screen all the information that you need to know to stay in touch with the Harlem Stage as well as Daniel Carlton. Make sure you check out this fantastic programming on Afrofuturism and the Harlem Renaissance. It just sounds so exciting. I will definitely be there.
Thank you. Yes.
So before we sign off, we're going to hear a little bit from Daniel Carlton so you can get a taste of what you're in for when you join the Harlem Stage and you participate in the program. But until next week, consider yourself blacklit. Thank you.
Hey Harlem, it's about that time for the soiree to begin, and you the better dime.
Why do you ask, do I rhyme? I'm waiting on that poet, Langston Hughes. He probably trying to get someone to pay him a penny to shine his shoes. You wouldn't know it, but that broke fellow is a poet. And yes, you always see my head in a book. I'm Crispus, the numbers man. It's okay to look. I ain't no ordinary crook. So I'm having fun in verse, and this ain't the Cotton Club, so I don't have to rehearse. If that little Langston Hughes don't show these parties, I'm still gonna go. Checking my invitations and get me some liquor. Oh, I mean libations. See, to call that stuff liquor is really using your imagination. See, up here, prohibition ain't nothing but a fancy word for give me some more from that liquor pot stirred. We got 50 parties to choose from. It's Saturday night, and we gonna treat it all right. If you like a good time, drop around where everything is fine. A social bidwiz party at 149 West 140th. MC Walker at the piano, refreshments. Well, that just means thin gin too. Let's see where else we could have gone. Reminds me to get my watch out of pawn. Joe, Sam, and Sydney. Well, all three have hit a number for me. They call themselves the Three Egyptians. I hope they don't have a conniption. They still a little country if you ask me. And you know how babies is born? It starts from drinking that down home corn. Yeah, there's sure some Negroes fresh out of the country, moved up here like thousands so they could be free. And from that mean old South where you can get killed if the wrong thing comes out your mouth. Me, I was born downtown in San Juan Hill, before Harlem was the new thrill. But Harlem has been good to me. Dollar bills, all that money. See, I'm in the numbers game, but it ain't the same. See, all these colored folks up here like me is trying to make a name, trying to be free. But we all waiting for that Langston Hughes. He's always asking about the blues. See, Mr. Hughes said he came all the way up here to Harlem to write. He said he wanted to take in all his sights. He said the pen is mightier than the sword when it comes to bringing darkness to light. I didn't know what he meant. They only do that when you're white. Being colored means you're always in a fight till you're so tired you're talking the blues. So that's why we got our parties up here. Hey man, I got to hit that party. Mr. Langston Hughes, I'm gonna have to see you.